Sometimes the most beautiful love stories begin in the darkest places. Sometimes two broken souls find each other when the whole world has turned away. In the winter of 1945, a captured German nurse was sent to a mountain man as a cruel joke. The soldiers thought he would either turn her away or make her life miserable. But this man had lost everything that mattered to him. His wife was gone. His faith in humanity was shattered. Yet when this enemy prisoner arrived at his cabin door, something unexpected happened. He saw past her uniform to the wounded woman beneath. She saw past his roughness to the gentle heart he'd buried. Through the long winter months, two people who should have been enemies became something much more. What started as survival became the kind of love that changes everything. But what was his real plan for her all along? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wedding ring sat on the windowsill, where it had rested every morning for 3 years, catching the first pale light that filtered through the frost-covered glass. Rolf Brenner paused in his daily ritual of stoking the fire, his weathered hands still for a moment as he gazed at the simple gold band. Anna's ring, the only piece of her he couldn't bring himself to put away. "Morning, Liebchen," he whispered to the photograph on the mantel, his voice rough from disuse. The woman in the sepia-toned image smiled back with eyes that had once held all the warmth his world contained. 3 years since tuberculosis had stolen her away, leaving him alone in their mountain sanctuary 12 miles from the nearest neighbor. The Colorado Rockies stretched endlessly beyond his cabin windows, their snow-capped peaks piercing a December sky, the color of old pewter. This was 1945, and somewhere far below in the valleys, the world was finishing a war that had already taken too much from too many. But here, at 8,000 feet above sea level, Rolf existed in a bubble of grief and routine that insulated him from everything except the memory of what he'd lost. He was 45 years old, though the mountain weather and sorrow had carved lines in his face that made him appear older. His hands, scarred from both the Great War and 20 years of working this unforgiving land, moved with practiced efficiency as he prepared his morning coffee. The same tin cup Anna had drunk from, the same strong brew she'd complained was too bitter but had grown to love. The cabin they'd built together stood as testament to their shared dreams. Hand-hewn logs chinked tight against the weather, a stone fireplace that drew perfectly, windows positioned to catch the morning sun. Anna had cherished. Every board, every nail had been placed with love and hope for the future they'd planned to share. Now it felt like a museum of might-have-beens. Rolf had come to these mountains as a young man, fresh from the trenches of France, where he'd served with distinction despite his German-born parents. The irony wasn't lost on him that he'd fought against the land of his ancestry, but America was his home, and he'd answered her call. The war had left its marks, not just the shrapnel scars on his left shoulder, but the deeper wounds that came from seeing too much death, from losing too many friends to the mud and gas of no man's land. Anna had found him in Denver in 1922, a broken veteran struggling to find his place in a world that had moved on without him. She was a teacher then, the daughter of German immigrants who understood the weight he carried. Her love had been his salvation, her dream of mountain solitude his redemption. Together they'd homesteaded this remote corner of Colorado, living simply but contentedly, planning for children who never came, aging gracefully in the thin, clean air. But tuberculosis was no respecter of dreams or devotion. It had taken her slowly. Consumption, eating away at her lungs while he watched helplessly. His crude medical knowledge no match for the disease. The nearest doctor was a day's hard ride through mountain passes that were impassable half the year. By the time he could get her to Denver, it was too late. She died in his arms on a February night, her last words a whispered request that he not let grief consume him as the disease had consumed her. He'd kept that promise poorly. 3 years of near solitude had followed, broken only by occasional supply runs to the small trading post at Timber Creek, where the locals had learned to expect his silence and respect his privacy. Some feared the mountain hermit who could track a deer through fresh snow and split logs with mechanical precision. Others pitied the widower who talked to his dead wife's photograph. None truly knew him anymore. The routines kept him sane, morning coffee and one-sided conversations with Anna's picture, checking his traps and hunting when meat ran low, chopping wood until his shoulders ached and blessed exhaustion promised dreamless sleep, reading by firelight from books Anna had loved, hearing her voice in the familiar passages. The days blended together in a haze of purposeful monotony, each one bringing him closer to whatever final rest awaited. Meanwhile, 200 miles to the east, another soul was learning the weight of captivity and uncertainty. Ingrid Hoffmann sat on the hard wooden bench of the military prison barracks, her German Medical Corps uniform faded and patched, but still bearing the dignity of someone who refused to be broken. At 28, she possessed the kind of beauty that came from strength rather than softness, sharp cheekbones that spoke of intelligence, green eyes that had seen too much suffering, and hands that had saved more lives than she could count. She'd been captured 3 months ago during the final collapse of German resistance in the Gommon Days, Italian Alps. As a battlefield nurse, she'd stayed behind when her unit retreated, refusing to abandon wounded soldiers who couldn't be moved. The American forces who found her had expected defiance or tears. Instead, they discovered a woman calmly organizing medical supplies and treating injured men, regardless of which uniform they wore. Her English was heavily accented but functional, learned from textbooks and improved through necessity. In the prison camp, she'd become the unofficial medical officer for guards and prisoners alike, her reputation for competence and compassion earning grudging respect even from those who saw her as the enemy. But respect didn't ease the weight of uncertainty. Letters from home had stopped coming months ago. Her family in Bavaria, her elderly parents, her younger brother Hans existed now only in memory and hope. The war was ending, everyone knew that. But what came next remained unclear. Would she be repatriated, tried for crimes she'd never been committed, left to rot in this Colorado military facility until bureaucracy decided her fate? The other German prisoners dealt with captivity in different ways. Some maintained rigid military discipline, others descended into despair or rage. Ingrid chose purpose. She organized the primitive medical bay, treated everything from homesickness to broken bones, and maintained the quiet dignity that had carried her through 4 years of war. She didn't know that her surname had already marked her for an unexpected destiny. 60 miles away, at the small military outpost that supplied the prison camp, Sergeant Dutch Kowalski was nursing both a hangover and a cruel sense of humor. A thick-set man from Chicago's South Side, Dutch had spent the war processing prisoners and supplies, never seeing real combat but developing the casual cruelty that came from too much boredom and too little purpose. "That mountain man ain't talked to nobody in months," he was telling Private Jimmy Barnes, a farm boy from Kansas who laughed too easily at Dutch's jokes. "Crazy old hermit up there, living like some kind of wild animal. Man needs company, if you know what I mean." Barnes giggled nervously. At 19, he was still young enough to find Dutch's schemes amusing rather than troubling. "What are you thinking, Sarge?" "Got us a German nurse down in Block C. Pretty thing, acts all high and mighty. Bet she'd change her tune real quick if she had to spend winter with that mountain man. Might teach 'em both some manners." The idea had been percolating in Dutch's mind for weeks. The German woman's composure irritated him, her refusal to show proper deference to her captors. And everyone knew about the hermit Brenner stories, circulated about the man who'd lost his wife and his mind, living alone up there like some kind of ghost. It would be amusing to see what happened when 2 damaged people were forced together. What Dutch didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Rolf Brenner had been watching for a Hoffman for 3 years. Anna's maiden name had been Hoffman. Her family had immigrated from Bavaria in the 1892, settling first in Denver before scattering across the American West. On her deathbed, Anna had made him promise to help any family member who might need it, a request born from her worry about relatives still in Germany. She'd given him names, told him stories, made him swear on their love that he wouldn't turn away from blood, no matter how distant. When the first prisoner reports had crossed his desk during his monthly supply runs, Rolf had noticed the name immediately. Ingrid Hoffmann, medic, captured in Italy. 28 years old. From Bavaria. The coincidence was too great to ignore. Anna's great-niece, perhaps? A cousin? It didn't matter. Anna had extracted his promise, and Rolf Brenner was a man who honored his word, even when honoring it might break what remained of his heart. So, when Sergeant Kowalski's crude plan reached his ears through the loose talk at the trading post, Rolf didn't object. Let them think they were playing a cruel joke. Let them imagine they were punishing both the German prisoner and the antisocial hermit. He would take custody of Ingrid Hoffmann, as they wanted, but for reasons they would never understand. The storm that was building over the Rockies would trap them together for months. What happened in that isolation would be shaped not by the soldier's malicious humor, but by a dying woman's love and a broken man's determination to honor her memory. Neither Rolf nor Ingrid knew they were about to become part of a story larger than either could imagine. Neither suspected that the cruel joke of petty men would become the foundation of something beautiful and enduring. But Anna's ring knew. It caught the winter light streaming through the cabin window and seemed to glow with promise, as if the spirit of the woman who'd worn it was already preparing the way for love to find its path through the darkness. The military transport truck lurched through the final switchback, its chains grinding against snow-packed ruts as it climbed toward Rolf's cabin. Inside the heated cab, Sergeant Kowalski whistled tunelessly, while Private Barnes gripped the door handle, his knuckles white as the vehicle swayed dangerously close to the mountain's edge. In the back, Ingrid Hoffmann sat rigidly upright, despite the jarring ride, her hands bound with rough rope that had already rubbed her wrists raw. She'd said nothing during the 3-hour journey, maintaining the stoic silence that had become her armor. The soldiers had offered no explanation for this transfer, only crude jokes about her new assignment that made her stomach clench with dread. Snow was falling steadily now, fat flakes that stuck to the truck's windshield faster than the wipers could clear them. The storm Dutch had been tracking was arriving ahead of schedule, which suited his purposes perfectly. By and tomorrow, the mountain roads would be impassable. Whatever happened between the German nurse and the hermit would play out without interference or witness. "There it is," Dutch announced, as the cabin came into view through the trees. Smoke rose from the stone chimney, and yellow light glowed warm in the windows. It looked peaceful, almost welcoming, which made what he was about to do feel even more amusing. "Home sweet home for our little Nazi nurse." Ingrid's jaw tightened at the slur, but she remained silent. She'd learned that protesting only encouraged their cruelty. The truck ground to a halt in the small clearing before the cabin, its engine ticking as it cooled. Dutch killed the motor and sat for a moment, grinning at his own cleverness. "Remember, Barnes, we're doing this as a favor to old Brenner. Man's been alone too long, probably gone a little simple. We're bringing him some company for the winter. What if he don't want her?" Barnes asked, though his tone suggested. He was already imagining the entertainment value. "Then he can do whatever he wants with her. Ain't our problem once we drive away?" They climbed out into the swirling snow, their boots crunching on the frozen ground. Dutch yanked open the truck's rear gate, while Barnes pulled Ingrid roughly to her feet. She stumbled slightly as she jumped down, her legs stiff from the long ride, but quickly regained her composure. The cabin door opened before they could knock. Rolf Brenner emerged onto the covered porch, moving with the careful deliberation of a man who'd learned to read situations quickly. He was taller than Ingrid had expected, broad-shouldered beneath a wool shirt that had seen many winters. His hair was dark brown, streaked with premature grey, and his eyes held the kind of depth that came from loss. When his gaze fell on her, she saw something flicker there, not the cruelty she'd braced for, but a strange sort of recognition. "Afternoon, Brenner," Dutch called out with false joviality. "Brought you a little Christmas present. Figured you might be getting lonely up here." Rolf's eyes never left Ingrid's face as he replied, "I didn't ask for company." "Course you didn't. That's what makes it a gift." Dutch shoved Ingrid forward, causing her to stumble on the icy steps. "German nurse, caught treating enemy wounded. Name's Hoffman or something like that. Figured you two might have some interesting conversations." "Hoffman," Ingrid said quietly, the first word she'd spoken since leaving the prison camp. "Ingrid Hoffman." Something shifted in Rolf's expression, so subtle that only someone watching closely would have noticed. His posture straightened slightly, and his hands, which had been clenched at his sides, slowly relaxed. "Well, ain't that sweet?" Dutch continued, oblivious to the undercurrent. "Already getting acquainted. Listen, Brenner, we got orders to leave her here for the winter. Prison camp's overcrowded, and you got the space. Government's paying you a stipend for her keep." This was the first Ingrid had heard of any stipend, and she suspected it was a lie designed to make Rolf more amenable to the arrangement. But the mountain man simply nodded, his attention still focused on her with an intensity that should have been frightening, but somehow wasn't. "She gives you any trouble," Barnes added with a snicker. "You just remind her who won the war." "I'll manage," Rolf said, his voice carrying a quiet authority that made both soldiers take an unconscious step back. Dutch pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket. "Transfer orders? Says you're responsible for her until spring, or until we come back for her, whichever comes first." Rolf took the document without reading it, his eyes still on Ingrid. She met his gaze steadily, refusing to show the fear that coiled in her belly. She'd survived 4 years of war, 3 months of captivity, and whatever indignities these crude soldiers had planned. She would survive this too. "Well, that's that then," Dutch announced, slapping his hands together. "Have fun, you two. Try not to kill each other before spring." The soldiers climbed back into their truck, engines roaring to life with obvious relief at having completed their unpleasant duty. They were gone within minutes, red taillights disappearing into the falling snow, leaving behind only the smell of exhaust and the sound of wind through the pines. Ingrid and Rolf stood facing each other in the growing dusk, two strangers bound together by circumstances neither had chosen. The snow fell steadily between them, and somewhere in the distance a lone wolf howled its ancient song of solitude. "Your hands," Rolf said finally, nodding toward her bound wrists. His voice was gentler than she'd expected, carrying traces of an accent she couldn't quite place. Ingrid looked down at the rough rope, then back at him with wary confusion. In her experience, captors didn't concern themselves with prisoner comfort. Without waiting for permission, Rolf stepped forward and produced a knife from his belt. Ingrid tensed automatically, but he moved slowly, deliberately, cutting through the ropes with careful precision that never brought the blade close to her skin. The bindings fell away, leaving red marks on her wrists that she rubbed gingerly. "Danke," she said quietly, then caught herself. "Thank you." "You're bleeding," he observed, noting where the rope had chafed her skin raw. "It's nothing. Come inside. The storm's getting worse." He turned and walked toward the cabin door, not checking to see if she followed. Ingrid hesitated for a moment, weighing her options. She could try to run, but where would she go? The nearest settlement was miles away through mountain wilderness, and she was dressed for prison barracks, not Colorado winter. The soldiers had made it clear that this arrangement had official sanction, which meant trying to escape would only bring worse consequences. More than that, something in Rolf's manner puzzled her. His movements held no threat, his voice carried no mockery. When he'd looked at her, She'd seen pain that mirrored her own, not the predatory interest she'd learned to fear from men in uniform. She followed him inside. The cabin's interior was smaller than it had appeared from outside, but warm and surprisingly comfortable. A fire crackled in the stone fireplace, casting dancing shadows on walls lined with books. The furniture was simple but well made, everything clean and organized with military precision. On the mantelpiece, a photograph of a dark-haired woman smiled down at the room. "Your wife?" Ingrid asked, drawn to the image despite herself. "Was," Rolf replied simply. "Anna, she died 3 years ago." The grief in his voice was unmistakable, and Ingrid felt an unexpected pang of sympathy. Loss was something she understood too well. "I'm sorry," she said, meaning it. Rolf studied her for a moment, as if trying to read something in her face. "Are you hungry?" The question caught her off guard. Prison food had been barely adequate, and the long ride had left her stomach empty and aching. But accepting his hospitality felt like crossing some invisible line she wasn't ready to cross. "I won't poison you," he said dryly, apparently reading her hesitation. "Whatever those soldiers told you about me, I'm not what they think I am." "What are you then?" "A man who keeps his promises," he said cryptically. "There's bread and soup. Sit by the fire and warm yourself." He disappeared into what she assumed was the kitchen, leaving her alone with the photograph on the mantel. Anna had been beautiful, with kind eyes and a smile that suggested laughter came easily. Looking at her, Ingrid could understand why a man might retreat from the world after losing such light. When Rolf returned with a bowl of thick vegetable soup and a chunk of fresh bread, Ingrid was still standing, exactly where he'd left her, uncertain and wary. "Sit," he said gently, indicating a chair near the fire. "You're safe here." The words hung between them, weighted with promise and possibility. As Ingrid slowly lowered herself into the offered chair, she wondered if she dared believe them. Outside, the storm howled its fury against the windows, sealing them together in this mountain sanctuary where two damaged souls would either destroy each other or discover something neither had expected to find again. Hope. The first week passed in a careful dance of distance and mutual assessment. Ingrid woke each morning to find a plate of food outside her door, thick slices of bread, sometimes eggs from chickens she could hear, clucking somewhere behind the cabin. Occasionally strips of venison jerky that spoke of Rolf's hunting skills. He never knocked, never demanded acknowledgement, simply left sustenance and retreated to allow her privacy. She appreciated this consideration more than she could express. In the prison camp, privacy had been a luxury no one possessed. Guards could enter the barracks at any hour, search personal belongings on whims, interrupt the most basic human functions without warning. Here, Rolf seemed to understand that dignity was something that had to be preserved, not granted. The room he'd given her was small but comfortable, clearly intended as storage, but hastily converted for her use. A narrow bed with clean blankets, a washstand with pitcher and basin, a single window that looked out toward the distant peaks. Most importantly, it had a door she could close and a wooden latch she could secure from the inside. The first night, she'd tested that latch a dozen times before finally allowing herself to sleep. Ingrid maintained her military discipline as best she could in these circumstances. She woke at dawn, made her bed with hospital corners, and kept her few possessions organized with Germanic precision. Her uniform, patched and faded though it was, she wore like armor. It reminded her who she was, where she'd come from, what she'd survived. Without it, she feared she might lose herself entirely in this strange mountain limbo. During those first days, she explored the cabin's limits cautiously. The main room served as both kitchen and sitting area, dominated by the massive stone fireplace that seemed to be the heart of the home. Shelves lined the walls, filled with books in both English and German, a detail that surprised her. Most Americans she'd encountered viewed anything German with suspicion, yet here were volumes of Goethe, Schiller, and Heine, sitting comfortably beside Mark Twain and Charles Dickens. The kitchen area was simple but well equipped, with cast iron pans that had been seasoned to a perfect black finish and knives kept sharp enough to shave with. Everything spoke of a man who lived alone but lived well, who took pride in his self-sufficiency without being ostentatious about it. Through the back window, she could see a small barn and what appeared to be a workshop, smoke occasionally rising from its chimney. Rolf spent much of his time there, emerging only for meals or to tend the fire. She wondered what occupied him in that space but didn't feel comfortable asking. On the third day, she discovered the chess set. It sat on a small table near the window, the pieces carved from two different woods, light pine and dark walnut. The craftsmanship was exquisite, each piece perfectly proportioned and smoothed to a satin finish. The board itself was inlaid with alternating squares of the same woods, fitted so precisely that the seams were barely visible. Ingrid found herself drawn to it repeatedly. Chess had been her father's passion, and he'd taught her the game during long Munich winters before the war changed everything. She hadn't played in years, but her fingers remembered the weight of the pieces, the satisfaction of a well-planned strategy unfolding across 64 squares. "Do you play?" The voice behind her made her jump. She hadn't heard Rolf approach, despite the cabin's wooden floors. He moved with the quiet efficiency of someone accustomed to stalking game through dense forest. "A little," she admitted, then added more honestly, "My father taught me. I used to be quite good." "Anna loved chess," he said, settling into the chair across from her. "We played most evenings. She usually won." There was warmth in his voice when he spoke of his wife, but also a sadness so deep it seemed to echo in the cabin's rafters. Ingrid studied his face, noting the lines around his eyes, the way his mouth turned down slightly at the corners even when he wasn't frowning. "Would you like to play?" he asked. The question hung between them, weighted with implications beyond a simple game. To play chess was to engage, to interact as equals rather than captor and prisoner. It meant conversation, strategy, the possibility of laughter or frustration, human emotions that bridged the gulf between enemy nationalities. Ingrid hesitated, her hand hovering over the white king. "Would that be appropriate?" "What's appropriate about any of this?" Rolf asked, with the first hint of humor she'd heard from him. A German nurse and an American hermit, trapped together by a snowstorm and the cruel humor of bored soldiers. "I think we can make our own rules." She picked up the king, feeling its familiar weight. "White moves first. I prefer black anyway," he said, settling more comfortably in his chair. "Anna always said I was too defensive, too willing to let my opponent make the first mistakes." Ingrid moved her king's pawn forward 2 squares, the same opening her father had taught her 20 years ago. "What did she do?" "Your wife? She taught school in Denver before we came here, 8-year-olds mostly. She said they were more honest than adults, easier to understand." He moved his own pawn to mirror hers. "What about your family? Are they still in Bavaria?" The question hit unexpectedly hard. Ingrid's hand stilled over her next move as memories flooded back her parents' small apartment in Munich, her brother Hans practicing violin in the evenings, the smell of her mother's strudel filling the kitchen on Sundays. "I don't know," she said quietly. "Letters stopped coming months ago. Hans was drafted into the Wehrmacht last year. My parents are old. They ran a small medical practice together. With the bombing," she stopped, unable to finish the thought. "Medical practice?" Rolf's attention sharpened. "Both of them?" "My father was a surgeon, my mother a midwife. They met at university in Vienna. I learned from watching them, helping in their clinic." She moved her knight, remembering countless evenings spent organizing medical supplies, watching her parents work together with the seamless coordination of long partnership. "Is that why you became a nurse?" "Someone had to help. When the war started, they needed medical personnel everywhere. I thought," she paused, considering how much to reveal. "I thought if I could save enough lives, maybe it would balance out all the death. Maybe God would notice the healing instead of just the killing." Rolf studied the board, but she sensed his attention was on her words rather than the game. Did it work? No, she said simply. There was always too much death. Too many boys dying for causes they didn't understand. Too many wounds that couldn't be healed. After a while, you stop trying to balance anything. You just try to save whoever's in front of you and hope it matters. They played in comfortable silence for several moves, the only sounds, the crackling fire and the soft click of wooden pieces on the board. Outside, wind howled through the pines, reminding them both that they were isolated here, cut off from the world that had thrown them together. "You're good," Rolf observed, as Ingrid executed a complex combination that put his king in check. "I had a good teacher." She smiled slightly, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her. "My father said chess taught you to think 3 moves ahead, to consider consequences before acting. He said it was good training for surgery. And for nursing, I imagine." "Yes, though in war, you don't always have time to think 3 moves ahead. Sometimes you can only react to what's immediately in front of you." Rolf moved his king to safety, but she could see he was already in trouble. Her pieces were better positioned, controlling more of the center board. Like now? The question carried weight beyond the game. Ingrid looked at him across the chessboard, this quiet man who had shown her nothing but kindness since her arrival, who spoke of his dead wife with tenderness and offered her food without expectation of gratitude. "Yes," she said. "Like now." The German-English dictionary had seen better days. Its leather binding was cracked, pages yellowed with age and use. But it became the bridge that spanned the chasm between their different worlds. Ingrid discovered it on the bookshelf during her second week at the cabin, wedged between a volume of Wordsworth poetry and a practical guide to mountain flora. "You may borrow it if you like," Rolf said when he noticed her examining the worn book, "though I suspect your English is better than you let on." "It serves," she replied carefully. "But there are, how do you say, nuances that escape me." They were sharing their evening meal at the small table, a routine that had evolved naturally over the past few days. Rolf had stopped leaving her food outside her door, instead inviting her to join him for supper. The conversations were still careful, formal, but they were conversations nonetheless. "Nuances," he repeated, pronouncing the word slowly. "Yes, English is full of those. My German is probably worse than your English, I'm afraid." Ingrid looked up from her soup with surprise. "You speak German?" "Enough to get by. My parents were born in Hamburg, came to America when I was very young. I learned English in school, but German was spoken at home." He hesitated, then added, "Anna's family was from Munich originally. Her grandmother spoke very little English, even after 50 years in Denver." "Munich." Ingrid's heart clenched at the familiar name. "My family lived there too, on Sendlinger Straße, near the cathedral. Anna's grandmother lived on Augustenstraße," Rolf said quietly. "Small world." They ate in contemplative silence, both lost in memories of a city that seemed impossibly distant from this mountain sanctuary. Outside, snow continued to fall steadily, adding to the drifts that had already made the cabin feel like an island in a white sea. "May I ask you something?" Ingrid ventured after a while. Rolf nodded, setting down his spoon. "Those soldiers, they spoke of you as if—" She searched for the right words. "They seemed to think you were dangerous, unstable. But you're not, are you?" A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "That depends on how you define dangerous. I prefer my own company to most people's. I don't go to town unless I must. I talk to my dead wife's photograph every morning." He met her eyes directly. "Some would call that unstable. Some would call it love," Ingrid said softly. The words hung between them, weighted with understanding. Rolf studied her face in the firelight, noting the way sorrow had carved its own lines around her eyes, the careful way she held herself as if braced against further loss. "You've lost someone too," he observed. "It wasn't a question." Ingrid nodded slowly. "Many someones. My patients, my friends, my—" She stopped, then forced herself to continue. "There was a doctor I worked with in Italy, Klaus Weber. We were. She gestured helplessly, unable to find words that bridged languages and loss. You loved him. Yes. He was killed during an artillery bombardment while treating wounded in a field hospital. He could have taken shelter, but there were soldiers who would have died without immediate attention. He chose to stay. Her voice broke slightly. He always chose to stay. Rolf reached across the table and briefly touched her hand, the first physical contact between them since he'd cut her bonds. His fingers were warm, calloused from years of mountain work, but gentle. I'm sorry, he said simply. They finished their meal in companionable silence, the dictionary sitting between them like a promise of better understanding to come. Later, as Ingrid helped clear the dishes, another routine that had developed naturally, she found herself studying the man who had become her unlikely host. He moved with economy and purpose, wasting no motion as he banked the fire for the night and checked the window latches against the storm. There was something almost military in his precision, and she found herself wondering about his service in the Great War. She knew from overheard conversations that he'd fought, but the details remained mysterious. Rolf, she said as he prepared to retreat to his own room. Using his name felt strange on her tongue, intimate in a way that made her slightly uncomfortable. He turned, waiting. Thank you. For the food, the shelter, she gestured around the warm cabin. The kindness. I know this wasn't your choice, wasn't it? He asked, his expression unreadable. Before she could ask what he meant, he had disappeared into his room, leaving her alone with the dying fire and a growing sense that there were currents in this situation she didn't yet understand. The next morning brought a minor crisis that would shift the dynamic between them yet again. Rolf had gone to check his traps, leaving Ingrid alone in the cabin for the first time since her arrival. She was attempting to prepare coffee using his unfamiliar equipment when she heard a crash from the direction of the barn, followed by a string of what she assumed were English curses. She found him in the workshop behind the barn, his left hand wrapped around a makeshift bandage that was already soaked through with blood. A broken saw blade lay on the workbench, its jagged edge stained red. "Let me see," she said, moving toward him with the automatic authority of someone trained to treat injuries. "It's nothing," he protested, but she was already unwrapping the crude bandage, her medical training overriding any social awkwardness. The cut was deep, running across his palm from thumb to pinky. It would need stitches to heal properly, and even then would leave a permanent scar. More immediately concerning was the amount of blood he'd already lost. "This is not nothing," she said firmly, slipping back into the clinical efficiency that had served her through 4 years of war. "You need proper treatment. Do you have medical supplies?" "Some. In the cabin there's a kit. Show me." 20 minutes later, Ingrid was threading a needle with steady hands, while Rolf sat at the kitchen table, his injured hand palm up on a clean towel. She'd found his medical kit primitive, but adequate, and had improvised improvements using supplies from her own small collection. "This will hurt," she warned, preparing to begin the first suture. "I've had worse," he said, but she noticed he gripped the table edge with his free hand. As she worked, cleaning and stitching the wound with practiced precision, their conversation flowed more naturally than it ever had before. Perhaps it was the familiarity of the medical setting, or maybe the reversal of their roles. She was the expert now, he the patient, depending on her skill. "You're very good at this," he observed, watching her neat, even stitches. "I should be. I've had plenty of practice." She tied off the final suture and began wrapping his hand with clean bandages. "The wound will heal cleanly if you keep it dry and change the dressing daily. I can do that for you, if you like." "I'd appreciate that." When she finished, they remained sitting at the table, his bandaged hand resting between them. The crisis had broken down another barrier, established a new level of trust and mutual dependence. "Thank you," he said quietly. "It's what I do," she replied. Then, more personally, "It's who I am." And for the first time since arriving at the cabin, Ingrid felt like herself again, not a prisoner, not a burden, but a healer whose skills had value. In tending Rolf's wound, she had begun to heal something in herself as well. The German-English dictionary was thick and well-worn, its pages soft from years of handling. Ingrid discovered it on the bookshelf during her second week at the cabin, wedged between a volume of Wordsworth and what appeared to be a treatise on mountain geology. She pulled it free carefully, noting the marginalia in what she recognized as Rolf's precise handwriting. German words with English translations noted alongside pronunciation guides written in careful script. "You studied German," she observed that evening, as they sat by the fire after dinner. It had become their routine shared meals, followed by quiet conversation or chess, the formal distance of those first days, gradually giving way to something approaching companionship. Rolf looked up from the book he was reading, a manual on winter survival that seemed redundant given his obvious expertise. During the war, the first war, I mean, Army thought it might be useful to have soldiers who could understand the enemy. Did you understand us? He set down his book and considered the question. Better than my commanding officers expected. German wasn't entirely foreign to me. My parents spoke it at home when I was young. They came from the Black Forest region, immigrated in 1885. This revelation shifted something in Ingrid's understanding of him. She'd assumed he was simply another American soldier, albeit one who'd chosen isolation over integration after his service. The knowledge that he carried German blood complicated the narrative she'd constructed about their situation. "Your parents must have had difficult years during the war," she said carefully. "They did. Neighbors who'd known them for 30 years suddenly viewed them with suspicion. My father lost customers at his bakery. Someone painted Hun Lover on our front door." Rolf's voice carried old pain. "That's partly why I enlisted. To prove our loyalty was to America, not the old country. And now I understand that loyalty isn't about the place your grandparents were born. It's about the choices you make, the people you choose to protect." He looked at her meaningfully. "Anna's family was German too. Her father came from Bavaria, actually. Same region as yours." The connection hung between them like a bridge neither had expected to find. Ingrid felt something loosen in her chest, a tension she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. "What was her family name?" she asked, though something in his expression suggested he'd been waiting for this question. "Hoffman," he said quietly. "Anna Hoffman before we married." Ingrid's breath caught. Hoffman is not uncommon, but her father was Wilhelm Hoffman, born in Munich in 1860. He had a brother named Heinrich, who stayed in Germany, became a doctor. Heinrich had children, grandchildren. The implications crashed over Ingrid like an avalanche. Her grandfather had been Heinrich Hoffmann, a doctor in Munich whose brother had emigrated to America in the 1882. Family stories spoke of Wilhelm, the adventurous younger brother who'd sought his fortune in the New World and never returned. "Anna was my cousin," she whispered. "She was family. I thought she might be. When I saw your name on the prisoner reports, heard you were from Bavaria, worked in medicine like Heinrich's family, too many coincidences." Rolf leaned forward, his expression intense. "Anna made me promise, before she died, if any Hoffman family ever needed help, I was to provide it. No questions asked, no conditions. The soldiers think they're playing a cruel joke," Ingrid said, understanding dawning. "But you planned this. Not planned, hoped for, maybe. When I heard they wanted to send you somewhere remote for the winter, I made sure they knew I could take a prisoner, told them I needed the government stipend." He smiled grimly. "There is no stipend." The weight of this revelation settled over Ingrid slowly. Everything she'd understood about her situation was wrong. She wasn't here as punishment or cruel entertainment. She was here because a dying woman had extracted a promise from her husband, and he was a man who honored his word, even when it meant taking in an enemy in wartime. "You could have told me," she said. "Could I? You've been a prisoner for months. How do you think you would have reacted if a stranger claimed to be family and said he was rescuing you? Would you have trusted it?" She considered this. No, I would have thought it was a trap or a different kind of cruelty. So I waited. Let you see for yourself what kind of man I am. Let you decide whether you could trust me. And now you know. You're not my prisoner, Ingrid. You're my guest and my responsibility. Anna's family. The fire crackled between them, throwing shifting patterns of light and shadow on the cabin walls. Outside, the wind continued its endless mountain song, but inside, something fundamental had changed. I don't know what happened to my parents, Ingrid said suddenly. Or to Hans. The bombing in Munich was terrible. Communications broke down completely in the final months. We'll find out, Rolf promised. When the war officially ends, when travel becomes possible again, we'll make inquiries. Anna left me some money, not much, but enough. If your family survived, we'll get word to them. If they need help, we'll provide it. Why would you do this for people you've never met? Because Anna asked me to. Because family matters, even when it's distant and complicated. Because I know what it's like to lose everyone you love and have nowhere to turn. Ingrid felt tears threaten for the first time since her capture. She'd held them back through months of uncertainty, through fear and degradation and loneliness. But kindness, unexpected, unconditional kindness from someone who owed her nothing, threatened to break the careful control she'd maintained. She must have been extraordinary, she said, looking toward Anna's photograph on the mantel. She was. She would have loved meeting you, knowing that Heinrich's family survived the war. She worried about them constantly after the fighting started. Tell me about her. Rolf's face softened, as it always did when he spoke of his wife. She believed people were fundamentally good, even when evidence suggested otherwise. She saw potential in everyone in me, when I was just a broken soldier with no future. She loved these mountains, but not for the isolation. She loved them because they were peaceful, because here she could focus on building something rather than surviving something. You built this cabin together, every log, every stone. She designed the layout, insisted on windows facing east for the morning light. The garden behind the house was hers, vegetables and herbs for cooking, wildflowers because they made her happy. His voice grew quieter. She wanted children to fill these rooms. We tried for years, but it wasn't meant to be. I'm sorry. Don't be. We had 15 good years together. Some people never get that. They sat in comfortable silence, the weight of shared understanding settling between them. Ingrid thought of her own losses, patients she couldn't save, friends who died in bombing raids, the family she might never see again. But for the first time in months, loss felt like something that could be survived rather than something that would inevitably destroy her. Thank you, she said finally, for honoring Anna's promise, for seeing me as family instead of enemy. Anna always said family wasn't just about blood. It was about choice, about who you decided to care for. Outside, the storm that had isolated them for 2 weeks was finally beginning to weaken, but neither of them minded. They had time now, and understanding, and the beginning of something that might eventually become trust. The pressed wildflower in Anna's Bible had been there so long that Ingrid almost missed it when she first opened the worn book. It was tucked between the pages of Psalms, a delicate mountain violet that had been carefully preserved between sheets of tissue paper. The flower was brittle now, its purple petals faded to lavender, but its placement spoke of reverence, of someone who had wanted to save a moment of beauty in the midst of life's difficulties. Anna loved wildflowers, Rolf explained when Ingrid asked about it, during their 3rd week together. That one came from the meadow, where I proposed to her. She pressed it that same day, said she wanted to remember the moment forever. They had established comfortable routines by now. Mornings began with Rolf tending the fire while Ingrid prepared breakfast, their movements coordinated like dancers who had rehearsed the same performance countless times. She changed his bandages each day, noting with professional satisfaction how cleanly the wound was healing. He taught her the quirks of the wood stove, the best places to hang wet clothes, the meaning of different wind sounds that predicted weather changes. The military stiffness had gradually left her bearing. She no longer wore her uniform jacket constantly, instead accepting the loan of one of Anna's sweaters, soft wool-dyed forest green that brought out the color of her eyes. The transformation was subtle but significant, like watching ice slowly melt in spring sunshine. "Tell me about the mountains in summer," she said one evening as they worked together, preparing vegetables for soup. Snow still fell steadily outside, but the worst of the storm had passed, leaving behind a world so white and pristine it seemed newly created. "Green," Rolf said simply, then seemed to realize she wanted more. Anna always said they came alive in spring. The meadows filled with flowers, paintbrush and lupine, columbine and larkspur. Alpine lakes so blue they don't seem real. The silence is different too, not empty like winter, but full of growing things. "It sounds beautiful." Anna wanted to paint them, but she was never satisfied with her attempts. She said the colors were too vivid for any canvas to capture. He paused in his chopping, lost in memory. She used to collect flowers instead, press them in her books. Said that way, she could keep pieces of summer to look at during the long winters. Ingrid thought of her own pressed flower discoveries throughout the cabin. Delicate blooms tucked into volumes of poetry, leaves preserved between pages of botanical guides. Anna's presence lingered everywhere, not like a ghost, but like a beloved friend who had stepped out briefly and might return at any moment. "What was she like?" Ingrid asked, surprising herself with the question. In the prison camp, personal inquiries had been discouraged. Privacy, a luxury no one could afford. But here, in this mountain sanctuary, normal social rules seemed suspended. "Stubborn," Rolf said immediately, then smiled at the memory. "She came up here with me when everyone said a city woman couldn't survive mountain winters. Proved them all wrong. She could split kindling, preserve meat, read weather signs, as well as any rancher's wife. But she kept her books, insisted on a proper garden, made me build her a window seat where she could read in the afternoon light. She sounds remarkable." She was. Anna saw beauty in everything: ice formations on the windows, the way snow caught in pine branches, the patterns frost made on the water bucket. She said God was an artist who never repeated himself. They worked in comfortable silence for a while, the easy quiet of people who no longer felt compelled to fill every moment with conversation. Outside, the wind had died to a whisper, and occasional bird calls suggested that even in the depths of winter, life persisted in these mountains. "I've been thinking," Ingrid said carefully, "about what happens when spring comes." Rolf's hands stilled over the cutting board. "What about it?" "The soldiers will return. They'll expect to find." She struggled for words. "They'll expect their joke to have played out as they intended. And what did they intend? You know what they intended." Her voice carried a mixture of anger and resignation. "They thought you would be cruel to me, or that I would break under harsh treatment. They wanted entertainment, a story to tell their friends about the crazy hermit and the German prisoner." Rolf set down his knife and turned to face her fully. "What do you think they'll find instead?" The question hung between them, loaded with implications neither was quite ready to address directly. What would the soldiers find? Two people who had learned to live together peacefully, who shared meals and conversation, who had developed the kind of easy partnership that usually took years to achieve, who looked forward to each other's company and dreaded the thought of separation. "I don't know," Ingrid said honestly. "I don't know what this is." "Neither do I," Rolf admitted, "but I know what it isn't. It isn't what those soldiers intended." They finished preparing dinner in thoughtful silence, both aware that they had touched on something important, but neither ready to examine it too closely. Later, as they sat by the fire with their evening chess game, Ingrid found herself watching Rolf's face in the flickering light. The harsh lines that had marked him when she first arrived had softened somehow. He smiled more easily now, laughed occasionally at her dry observations about American customs or his own stubborn habits. "Check," she announced, moving her queen into position. "Already?" He studied the board with surprise. "I didn't see that coming." You were distracted tonight. Was I? He moved his king to safety, but she could see he was still in trouble. What was I distracted by? The question was innocent enough, but something in his tone made her look up from the board to meet his eyes. What she saw there made her breath catch a warmth that went beyond mere friendship, an interest that was distinctly male and altogether unsettling. I should probably go to bed, she said quickly, starting to rise from her chair. Ingrid. Her name on his lips stopped her mid-motion. Are you afraid of me? The question was asked gently, without accusation, but it demanded an honest answer. She settled back into her chair and considered it carefully. No, she said finally. I'm not afraid of you, but I think perhaps I should be. Why? Because this, she gestured between them, encompassing the chess game, the comfortable conversation, the way they moved around each other in the small cabin like pieces of the same whole. This isn't what either of us expected, and when spring comes, when the real world intrudes again, we'll face that. When it happens, Rolf said quietly. For now, we're here, safe. Maybe that's enough. But as Ingrid lay in her narrow bed that night, listening to the wind whisper through the pines, she wondered if anything could ever be enough again, once you'd discovered something you hadn't known you were missing. The thought both thrilled and terrified her in equal measure. Outside, snow continued to fall, sealing them deeper into their mountain sanctuary, where time moved differently and hearts could heal in ways that defied all logic and expectation. The blizzard that struck in their fourth week together was unlike anything Ingrid had ever experienced. For 3 days, wind howled around the cabin with such ferocity that the windows rattled in their frames and snow piled against the door until Rolf had to dig them out each morning just to reach the woodpile. The world beyond their small sanctuary disappeared entirely, whited out by a wall of driving snow that made venturing more than 10 feet from the cabin not just dangerous, but impossible. On the second night, when the temperature dropped so low that frost formed on the inside walls despite the roaring fire, they made a practical decision that would change everything between them. The small bedroom where Ingrid slept had no direct heat source, and her breath was visible in crystalline puffs when she spoke. "You'll freeze in there," Rolf said matter-of-factly, noting how she shivered despite wearing Anna's heaviest sweater over her own clothes. "The fire's the only thing keeping this place livable." They dragged her mattress into the main room, positioning it near the hearth, but at a respectful distance from Rolf's own bedding. The arrangement was born of necessity, not romance, but physical proximity bred intimacy in ways neither had anticipated. They fell asleep to the sound of each other's breathing, woke to quiet conversations in the pre-dawn darkness, shared the vulnerable honesty that comes with the territory between sleep and full consciousness. It was during one of these twilight conversations that Ingrid finally told him about the day Klaus died. "We were in a temporary field hospital, really just tents and canvas stretched between trees," she said, her voice barely audible above the storm outside. "The artillery started at dawn. We could hear the shells getting closer, but Klaus kept working. There was a boy, couldn't have been more than 17, shrapnel in his abdomen. Klaus said he could save him if he had 10 more minutes." She was quiet for so long that Rolf thought she'd fallen asleep. Then her voice came again, smaller now, filled with old pain. "I begged him to leave the boy, to come with me to the bunkers. He looked at me like I'd asked him to cut off his own hands. 'I can't abandon him, Liebster,' he said. 'You know I can't.' So I stayed too. I couldn't leave Klaus, and Klaus couldn't leave his patient." "What happened?" "The shell hit our tent directly. Klaus threw himself over the boy at the last second, trying to shield him. They both died instantly. I was thrown clear, barely scratched. For months afterward, I wondered if I could have saved them somehow, if I'd been faster, smarter, braver." "You can't save everyone," Rolf said gently. "I learned that in France. Sometimes the choice isn't between saving and losing. Sometimes it's between losing one and losing many. Is that how you survived? By choosing who to save?" Rolf was quiet for a long moment, staring at the fire's dying embers. I survived by being lucky, and by having someone to come home to. Anna wrote me every week, sent photographs, told me about her students and the garden she was planning for when I returned. She gave me a reason to keep fighting when everything else seemed pointless. Do you think she would approve of this? Ingrid asked suddenly. Of me being here, in her home? Anna believed people were fundamentally good, regardless of what uniform they wore or what language they spoke. She would have liked you, I think. You have her stubbornness, her refusal to give up even when circumstances seem hopeless. I'm not brave like she was. You're here, aren't you? Surviving in a foreign country, among people who consider you an enemy, maintaining your dignity and your compassion despite everything you've lost. If that's not brave, I don't know what is. The third morning of the blizzard brought an unexpected crisis. Rolf had gone out to check the animals in the barn and failed to return after an hour. Ingrid, growing, increasingly worried, bundled herself in every warm garment she could find and ventured into the storm to look for him. She found him collapsed halfway between the barn and the cabin, unconscious in a drift that had nearly buried him. His lips were blue with cold, his breathing shallow and rapid. Drawing on her medical training and reserves of strength she didn't know she possessed, Ingrid managed to drag him back to the cabin, her own fingers growing numb with cold as she struggled through snow that reached her waist. Getting his wet clothes off and warming his body became a matter of survival that overrode any considerations of modesty or propriety. She stripped him efficiently, wrapped him in blankets, and pressed her own body against his to share her warmth, a technique she'd learned treating hypothermia cases during the war. For hours, she held him, monitoring his breathing, chafing his hands and feet to restore circulation, forcing warm liquid between his lips when he was conscious enough to swallow. It was intimate in a way that transcended physical attraction, the fundamental intimacy of one person fighting to preserve another's life. When Rolf finally came fully conscious near evening, the first thing he saw was Ingrid's face, hovering over his, her eyes bright with tears of relief. "You scared me," she whispered, her hands stroking his forehead with unconscious tenderness. "I'm sorry," he replied, his voice hoarse. The wind shifted. I lost my bearings between the barn and the house. Everything looked the same. "Don't apologize. Just don't leave me alone like that again." The words hung between them, carrying more weight than their literal meaning. Don't leave me. Not just during blizzards, but ever. Don't make me face the world without you. "I won't," he promised, and something in his tone told her he understood the deeper meaning. That evening, as the storm finally began to subside, they sat closer together than they ever had before. The shared blanket was practically a necessity given the cold, but neither moved away when the fire began to warm the room again. Their conversation flowed with a new ease, barriers dissolved by the day's crisis and the growing certainty that what was happening between them was more than friendship, more than convenience, more than two lonely people seeking comfort. "Ingrid," Rolf said as they prepared for sleep, their makeshift beds now pushed together without pretense. "Yes, when this is over, when spring comes and the world intrudes again." He paused, seeming to struggle with words. "I want you to know that these weeks, this time with you, it's been the first time since Anna died that I've felt truly alive." She turned to face him in the firelight, seeing honesty and vulnerability in his expression that took her breath away. "For me as well," she said simply. "You've given me back pieces of myself I thought the war had destroyed forever." They fell asleep, holding hands across, the narrow space between their beds, fingers intertwined, like promises they weren't yet ready to speak aloud, but were no longer afraid to feel. The letter was hidden behind Anna's photograph, discovered purely by accident when Ingrid was dusting the mantelpiece and the frame slipped from her hands. As she bent to retrieve it, a folded piece of paper fluttered to the floor. Old paper, yellowed at the edges, with writing in what appeared to be German script. Her heart hammered as she unfolded it, recognizing immediately that it was addressed to her. Not to the German prisoner or Fraulein, but specifically Liebste Ingrid Hoffmann. The letter was dated 3 days before her arrival at the cabin. With trembling hands, she read words that would shatter everything she thought she understood about her situation. My dearest Ingrid Hoffmann, if you are reading this, then God has answered the prayer I have carried in my heart for 3 years. You do not know me, but I know of you. Through stories my beloved wife Anna told of her family in the old country. Anna Hoffmann-Brenner was your father's cousin. Heinrich Hoffmann's daughter became my wife, and through her I learned of the Hoffmann family scattered across Bavaria. Anna died in my arms in 1942, but not before extracting a promise that has guided every day since. She begged me to help any member of her family who might need sanctuary, to honor the bonds of blood, even across the distance of war and ocean. I gave her my word, knowing that words to a dying wife are sacred vows that must be kept. When I saw your name on the prisoner lists during my supply runs to town, I knew immediately who you must be. Heinrich's granddaughter, Anna's young cousin who became a nurse like her grandmother before her. Anna often spoke of the family tradition of healing, how the women of your line had always tended the sick and wounded regardless of politics or nationality. I want you to understand, your presence here is not the cruel joke those soldiers believe it to be. I arranged this myself, though they will never know it. Sergeant Kowalski thinks he conceived this plan in his malicious imagination, but I planted the seeds of the idea over weeks of careful conversation. Let him believe it was his inspiration. It serves our purposes better. You are not my prisoner, Ingrid. You are my family, the only blood connection I have left to the woman who was my life's greatest blessing. I offer you sanctuary, not from duty but from love, love for Anna's memory and respect for the courage that has brought you through war to this mountain refuge. I do not know what kind of woman you have become, whether the years have made you bitter or gentle, whether you will welcome this revelation or resent the manipulation it represents. I know only that you are Anna's blood, and therefore precious to me beyond my ability to express. Your cousin by marriage, Friedrich Rolf Brenner. Ingrid read the letter twice, then a third time, her mind reeling with implications that reshaped every interaction they'd shared. The kindness she'd attributed to his character, the unexpected gentleness that had surprised and comforted her, all of it had been planned, orchestrated. Part of a promise made to a dying woman whose blood she carried. The sound of boots on the porch announced Rolf's return from checking his traps. Ingrid quickly refolded the letter but didn't hide it. Instead, she stood facing the door, holding the paper like evidence of a crime, her face a mask of confusion and betrayal. Ingrid? Rolf stopped short when he saw her expression. What's wrong? Friedrich, she said, pronouncing his German name with careful precision. Were you planning to tell me, or was I supposed to discover this by accident? His face went pale as he saw the letter in her hands. For a long moment, he said nothing, just stood in the doorway with snow melting off his boots, the weight of truth settling between them, like a wall. How long have you known? She asked when he remained silent. Since the day you arrived. Since before you arrived. He stepped inside and closed the door behind him, his movements careful and deliberate. I recognized your surname immediately. Anna was my father's cousin? Yes, her grandmother and your great-grandmother were sisters. Anna used to tell me stories about the family gatherings when she was small, before her parents immigrated to America. She spoke of a cousin, Heinrich, who stayed behind, who married a midwife and raised children who carried on the family tradition of healing. Ingrid sank into the chair by the fire, the letter crackling in her tightening grip. So this was all planned. Your kindness, your gentleness, the way you've treated me, it was all obligation. Duty to a dead woman's promise. No. The word came sharp and immediate. It began that way. I won't lie to you. Anna made me promise to help any family member in need, and when I saw your name on those prisoner lists, I knew I had to honor that promise. But what's happened between us? He moved closer, his voice growing more urgent. Ingrid, what I feel for you now has nothing to do with promises or obligation. How can I believe that? She stood abruptly, pacing to the window and back. How can I trust anything you've said or done when it was all based on manipulation from the beginning? Because you know me, Rolf said quietly. You've lived with me for weeks, seen me at my worst and best. You've watched how I mourn Anna, how I struggle with my own ghosts. You know I'm not capable of the kind of deception you're imagining. Am I your prisoner or your guest? Your responsibility or your... She stopped, unable to voice the question that hung between them. You're my family, he said simply. You always were, from the moment you stepped out of that truck. But you've become something more, something Anna could never have anticipated when she extracted that promise. Ingrid turned to face him fully, tears streaming down her cheeks. I thought I was healing you. I thought somehow, despite everything, I was helping you find your way back to life. But you weren't broken, were you? You were just keeping a promise. I was broken, Rolf said fiercely. 3 years of talking to photographs and avoiding human contact. Yes, I was broken. And yes, you've helped heal me in ways I never expected. The fact that you're Anna's family doesn't diminish that. If anything, it makes it more remarkable. How can you separate the two? How can I? Because love doesn't diminish when it's rooted in something deeper than chance, he said, approaching her slowly, as if she were a wounded animal that might bolt. Anna loved you before she ever met you, loved the idea of you based on family stories and blood connections. I love you because of who you are, your strength, your compassion, your stubborn refusal to be broken by a world that's tried its hardest to destroy you. You manipulated those soldiers, arranged this entire situation. I gave you sanctuary. I offered you safety and dignity when the alternative was remaining a prisoner indefinitely, subject to the whims of men like Kowalski, who see you as nothing more than entertainment. His voice grew harder. Would you rather I had left you there? Let their cruel joke play out as they intended? Ingrid stared at him, this man who had become so dear to her, trying to reconcile the calculated planner who had arranged her rescue with the gentle soul who had shown her such tenderness. I don't know what to think anymore. I don't know what's real between us and what's obligation. Then let me show you, Rolf said, reaching for her hands. Let me prove that what I feel for you has nothing to do with promises to the dead and everything to do with the living woman standing in front of me. But Ingrid pulled away, shaking her head. I need time to think. I need to understand what this means, what we are to each other now that I know the truth. She retreated to her room, leaving Rolf standing alone by the fire, with Anna's photograph watching from the mantel. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the windows as if the mountain itself was unsettled by the revelation that had shaken the foundation of everything they'd built together. In her small room, Ingrid sat on the narrow bed and read the letter once more, searching for clues about the man she thought she'd come to know. The careful handwriting, the formal language that barely contained deep emotion, the love for a dead woman that had shaped every action since it painted a picture of someone more complex than she'd imagined, someone capable of both profound devotion and careful manipulation. The question that haunted her wasn't whether his feelings were real. She'd seen too much of his unguarded humanity to doubt that. The question was whether she could trust a love that had been built on such calculated foundations, whether something genuine could grow from seeds planted in deception, no matter how well-intentioned. Outside her window, snow began to fall again, as if the mountain was pulling its white blanket higher, protecting its secrets for a little while longer. The train ticket to San Francisco lay on the kitchen table like an accusation, its neat printing promising escape to a world where Ingrid Hoffman could disappear entirely. Rolf had procured it during his supply run to Timber Creek, along with forged papers that would give her a new identity and passage to Anna's distant relatives in California, people who would ask no questions about a German woman seeking sanctuary in the final days of the war. It's the safest option, Rolf said quietly, not looking at her as he explained the arrangements he'd made. Anna's cousin Margaret lives in San Francisco with her husband. They run a boarding house near the harbor, cater to immigrants who need time to establish themselves. You could work there, use your medical training to help people build a new life. Stop. Ingrid's voice cut through his careful planning like a blade. Just stop talking for a moment. They had barely spoken in the 3 days since she'd discovered his letter, their conversations reduced to stilted exchanges about practical matters, meals, weather, the gradual melting that signaled winter's approaching end. The easy intimacy they'd built over weeks had cracked like ice under sudden pressure, leaving behind a careful politeness that hurt more than anger would have. Now, faced with this evidence of his willingness to let her go, Ingrid felt something break inside her chest. "You want me to leave," she said. "It wasn't a question. I want you to be safe," Rolf replied, finally meeting her eyes. "I want you to have choices that don't involve staying with a man who manipulated your situation from the beginning. And what if I don't want safety? What if I want she?" Stopped, unable to voice the words that would make her feelings undeniably real. "What do you want, Ingrid?" The question hung between them, loaded with months of careful friendship, growing attraction, and the devastating revelation that had shattered her understanding of their relationship. What did she want? To go back to Germany and search for family who might be dead? To start over in California among strangers who would never understand what she'd endured? To pretend that these weeks in the mountains had been just an interlude, a brief respite before returning to the harsh realities of a post-war world? Before she could answer, the sound of vehicles approaching broke the tension. Through the window, they could see 2 military trucks laboring up the mountain road, their olive-drab paint stark against the white landscape. "They're early," Rolf said grimly. "Spring doesn't officially start for another 2 weeks. Ingrid felt panic rise in her throat. She wasn't ready for this confrontation, wasn't prepared to face Sergeant Kowalski and his crude expectations. More than that, she wasn't ready to leave this mountain sanctuary where she'd rediscovered pieces of herself she'd thought lost forever. "What do we tell them?" she asked. "The truth," Rolf said, moving to collect the train ticket and forged papers. "That you've been treated according to the Geneva Convention, that you're healthy and unharmed, and that you're ready to be transferred to wherever they plan to send you next. Is that what you want? To hand me over as if these weeks meant nothing?" Rolf stopped his movements, his hands tightening on the papers. "What I want has never mattered in this situation. What matters is your safety and your future." "My future," Ingrid repeated. "Not our future." The trucks had stopped outside now, engines ticking as they cooled. Voices carried on the thin mountain air. Kowalski's harsh laugh, Barnes's nervous chatter, and other voices she didn't recognize. Officials, perhaps, people who would decide her fate based on paperwork and regulations rather than the complex reality of what had happened in this isolated cabin. "Ingrid," Rolf said urgently, "there's something else you need to know before they come in here. The war Germany surrendered a week ago. Hitler is dead. It's over." The words hit her like a physical blow. Over. The war that had defined her adult life, that had taken Klaus and scattered her family and brought her to this mountain, it was finished. She should feel relief, joy, something approaching hope. Instead, she felt only a deep emptiness, as if the end of the conflict had also ended her reason for existing. "What happens to prisoners of war when the war ends?" she asked. "Repatriation, usually." "They'll send you back to Germany to rebuild whatever's left." He paused, watching her face. "Unless you have somewhere else to go. Someone else to be." The knock on the door interrupted them before she could respond. Rolf moved to answer it while Ingrid stood frozen in the kitchen, the train ticket still lying on the table like a promise of escape. "Afternoon, Brenner," came Kowalski's voice from the porch. "Come to collect our little gift. Hope she didn't give you too much trouble." "No trouble," Rolf replied evenly. "She's been a model prisoner. Footsteps echoed on the wooden floors as the soldiers entered, bringing with them the smell of tobacco and the harsh reality of the outside world. Ingrid heard other voices, an officer asking questions about her condition, someone discussing transport arrangements, a clerk reading from official documents. "Where is she?" Kowalski demanded. "Don't tell me the crazy hermit actually killed her. That would ruin the whole joke." "I'm here," Ingrid said, emerging from the kitchen with as much dignity as she could muster. She had changed back into her military uniform, the faded fabric hanging loose on her frame, but still carrying the authority of her rank and training. The soldiers studied her with obvious surprise. Whatever they had expected to find after months with the mountain hermit, it wasn't this composed, well-fed woman who met their gaze without flinching. "Well, I'll be damned," Kowalski muttered. "You look better than when we dropped you off. Brenner been taking good care of you." "Adequately," Ingrid replied carefully, aware that Rolf was listening to every word. A lieutenant she didn't recognize stepped forward, consulting a clipboard. "Ingrid Hoffmann, former German Medical Corps. I'm Lieutenant Morrison. We're here to process your repatriation. With the war's end, all prisoners of war are being returned to their countries of origin unless they have specific requests for alternative placement." Alternative placement. The phrase echoed in Ingrid's mind as she glanced toward the kitchen where the train ticket waited. Rolf had given her an option, a way to disappear into America and build a new life free from complications of their shared history. All she had to do was claim it. "I need a moment," she said, "to gather my belongings." "Make it quick," Morrison replied. "We have other stops to make before dark." Ingrid retreated to her small room, aware that this might be the last time she stood in this space that had become sanctuary. Her few possessions were quickly packed: the clothes Anna had shared, a pressed flower she'd kept from one of their walks, the German-English dictionary that had bridged their different worlds. Through the thin walls, she could hear the soldiers questioning Rolf about her behavior, her health, whether she had attempted escape or caused any problems. His answers were brief and professional, giving them no ammunition for their crude curiosity. "She ever try anything with you?" she heard Kowalski ask with obvious disappointment. "Figured a pretty thing like that might try to win herself some special treatment. She conducted herself with honor," Rolf replied, his voice carrying a warning that even Kowalski seemed to recognize. Ingrid sat on the narrow bed and held the train ticket, reading the destination over and over. San Francisco, a new name, a new life, a chance to start over in a country that had shown her unexpected kindness. It was everything a refugee could hope for: safety, anonymity, the possibility of peace, but it wasn't what she wanted. What she wanted was standing in the next room, carefully answering questions designed to uncover whether he had shown her the mercy his heart demanded or the cruelty the soldiers had expected. What she wanted was the man who had honored his dead wife's promise but found space in his healing heart for new love. What she wanted was the life they had built together in this mountain sanctuary, imperfect and complicated though it might be. She folded the train ticket and slipped it into her pocket, not as escape, but as reminder of the choice she was about to make. When she emerged from her room with her small bundle of belongings, all eyes turned to her. The soldiers were impatient to leave. The officer was consulting his schedule, and Rolf was standing by the window, his face a mask of careful neutrality. "Ready?" Morrison asked. Ingrid looked at Rolf, memorizing his face in case this was the last time she would see it. Then she turned to face the officer with the clear, steady voice of someone who had finally decided what her life was worth. "I have a request for alternative placement," she said. Lieutenant Morrison looked up from his clipboard with obvious surprise. "Alternative placement? What kind of alternative placement?" Ingrid felt every eye in the room focus on her, the weight of their attention almost overwhelming. She could see Kowalski's confusion, Barnes's nervous curiosity, and most importantly, Rolf's carefully controlled expression as he tried to understand what she was about to do. "I wish to remain in the United States," she said, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. "I have family connections here, and I request permission to stay rather than be repatriated to Germany." "Family connections?" Morrison frowned, consulting his papers. "I don't show any American relatives in your file." "By marriage," Ingrid continued, the words coming easier now that she'd committed to this path. "Mr. Brenner was married to my cousin Anna Hoffman. This makes us family under both German and American law." The silence that followed was deafening. Kowalski's mouth fell open. His crude joke suddenly transformed into something he couldn't comprehend. Barnes looked back and forth between Ingrid and Rolf, as if trying to solve a puzzle. Morrison shuffled through his papers with bureaucratic confusion. "Is this true?" Morrison asked Rolf directly. Rolf met the officer's gaze steadily. "Yes, my wife Anna was born Anna Hoffman in Denver. Her father Heinrich was first cousin to Ingrid's father in Munich. We discovered the family connection during her stay here." "Well, I'll be damned," Kowalski muttered, then caught himself. "Begging your pardon, sir. But when we brought her here, we had no idea." "No," Rolf said quietly. "You had no idea." Morrison was scribbling notes, clearly out of his depth with this unexpected development. "This complicates things significantly. Family connections can provide grounds for immigration status, but there are procedures, paperwork, background checks." "How long would such procedures take?" Ingrid asked. "Months, possibly longer. The immigration system is overwhelmed with displaced persons from Europe. We'd need to verify the family relationship, process your application, conduct security reviews." Morrison looked increasingly uncomfortable with each requirement he listed. "And in the meantime?" Rolf spoke for the first time since the revelation, his voice carrying a quiet authority that made everyone listen. "What happens to her while you process? Paperwork? Well, she'd need to remain in custody. We have facilities for displaced persons in Denver, or she could be transferred to one of the larger camps until no." The word came from Ingrid with such force that it surprised even her. "I will not return to a camp. I will not be imprisoned again while bureaucrats shuffle papers and decide my fate. Ma'am, with respect, you don't have much choice in the matter. You're still technically a prisoner of war until your status is officially changed." "She has a choice," Rolf interrupted. "If she's family, if there's a legitimate relationship here, then I can sponsor her immigration application. Take responsibility for her welfare while the paperwork is processed." Kowalski finally found his voice. "Wait just a minute. You're saying this whole time, while we thought we were pulling a prank on the mountain hermit, he was actually what? Harboring a relative? You were delivering my wife's cousin to the only family she had left in America," Rolf said simply. "Though you couldn't have known that at the time. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the room. What Kowalski had intended as cruel entertainment had become an act of mercy, a reunion of scattered family members across the chasm of war. The joke was on him, but not in any way he could have anticipated." Morrison was looking more and more uncomfortable with the situation. "This is highly irregular. I don't have the authority to make decisions about immigration status or family sponsorship. This would need to go up the chain of command, possibly all the way to Washington." "How long would that take?" Ingrid asked again. "Weeks, at minimum, maybe months, and I would spend that time in a detention facility, unless—" Morrison stopped, clearly reluctant to voice what he was thinking. "Unless what?" Rolf prompted. "Unless we could arrange temporary custody with a responsible party, someone who could guarantee her appearance for all required proceedings, someone with standing in the community." Morrison looked at Rolf speculatively. "You own property here? You're an American citizen in good standing?" "Yes, to both. I've lived on this mountain for 20 years. Served my country in the Great War, paid my taxes, caused no trouble for anyone. It's not standard procedure. Nothing about this situation is standard," Rolf pointed out. "But if you're looking for someone to take responsibility for Ingrid's welfare while her status is determined, I'm willing to do so." Morrison chewed his pencil, clearly wrestling with a decision that was above his pay grade. Behind him, Kowalski was shaking his head in disbelief, while Barnes looked like he was watching the most entertaining show of his life. "I'd have to make some phone calls," Morrison said finally. "Check with my superiors, verify the family relationship, confirm that this arrangement would be acceptable to the immigration authorities. Make your calls." Ingrid said, "I'll wait." She looked at Rolf across the crowded room, seeing surprise and something that might have been hope in his expression. This wasn't the escape he'd planned for her, wasn't the safe new identity in California he'd thought she wanted. This was something far more dangerous, a choice to stay and fight for what they'd built together, regardless of how it had begun. The telephone calls took 3 hours and involved what seemed like half the military bureaucracy between Colorado and Washington, D.C. Morrison had requisitioned Rolf's neighbor's phone, and the small trading post at Timber Creek became an impromptu immigration office as papers were faxed, records were verified, and officials who had never heard of Ingrid Hoffman suddenly found themselves making decisions about her fate. During the wait, the soldiers made themselves uncomfortable in Rolf's cabin, drinking his coffee and speculating about the situation they'd unwittingly created. Ingrid sat by the window, outwardly calm, but internally, wrestling with the magnitude of what she'd set in motion. She had burned her bridges. Now there would be no quiet escape to California, no chance to disappear into anonymity. She had chosen to fight for a life she wasn't even sure she had a right to claim. "You sure about this?" Rolf asked quietly during a moment when the soldiers were distracted by Morrison's increasingly animated phone conversations. "No," Ingrid admitted. "I'm not sure about anything anymore. But I know I can't go back to Germany, and I know I don't want to run away to California and spend the rest of my life wondering what might have been." "And what is it you think might be?" She met his eyes directly. "A chance to find out if what we built here was real or just two lonely people taking comfort in each other during a hard winter." Before Rolf could respond, Morrison returned from his latest phone call, his expression a mixture of relief and bewilderment. "Well," he announced, to the room, "I've spoken with 3 different departments, 2 immigration officials, and 1 very confused colonel. The consensus seems to be that while this situation is highly irregular, it's not impossible to resolve." "Meaning?" Ingrid asked. "Meaning the family relationship checks out. Anna Hoffman Brenner was indeed your father's cousin, which establishes a legitimate basis for family reunification. Mr. Brenner's military service record and community standing make him an acceptable sponsor for temporary custody pending your immigration hearing." Ingrid felt her knees go weak with relief. She had gambled everything on bureaucratic flexibility and won. "However," Morrison continued, raising a warning hand, "this arrangement comes with conditions. You'll be required to report to immigration authorities in Denver once a month. You cannot leave Colorado without permission. Mr. Brenner becomes legally responsible for your conduct and appearance at all required proceedings. Any violation of these terms will result in immediate detention and deportation." "I understand," Ingrid said. "And Mr. Brenner, you understand that taking custody of a former enemy prisoner is a serious responsibility? You're vouching for her character, her intentions, her loyalty to this country." Rolf stood straighter, and for a moment Ingrid could see the soldier he'd once been. "I am." Morrison shuffled his papers one more time, then began pulling out forms. "In that case, we have paperwork to complete. Immigration applications, custody agreements, release documents. This is going to take a while." As Morrison spread documents across Rolf's kitchen table, Kowalski finally found his voice again. "I still can't believe this," he muttered. "All this time, we thought we were sticking him with some random German prisoner, and it turns out they're family?" "Not family," Rolf corrected quietly. "Not yet, but Anna's family, which amounts to the same thing." The paperwork took another 2 hours. Signatures, witnesses, official stamps that transformed Ingrid from prisoner of war to immigration applicant with temporary custody status. With each form completed, her legal existence in America became more solid, more real. When Morrison finally packed up his papers and prepared to leave, the sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of rose and gold. The soldiers climbed back into their trucks with the bewildered air of men who had started the day with a simple prisoner transfer and ended it, witnessing something they didn't quite understand. "We'll be in touch," Morrison told them through the truck window. "First report is due in Denver in 30 days. Don't be late." As the vehicles disappeared down the mountain road, their engine noise fading into evening silence, Rolf and Ingrid stood on the cabin porch and watched the last traces of their departure. "Well," Rolf said finally, "that wasn't how I expected this day to go. Were you disappointed when I chose to stay instead of taking the train ticket to California?" He turned to look at her, this woman who had become so much more than his wife's distant cousin, so much more than a promise he'd felt obligated to keep. "Anna always said that love was about choosing each other every day, not just once," he said. "She said the first choice might be impulse or chemistry or circumstance, but the choice to stay, to build something together, to work through difficulties, that was real love." "And is that what you want? To choose each other every day?" "It's what I've wanted since the night you saved my life in the blizzard," he admitted. "But I needed to know it was what you wanted too, freely chosen, not obligation or gratitude or lack of other options." Ingrid smiled, the first completely unguarded expression he'd seen from her since she'd discovered his letter. "Then I suppose we should start choosing." 6 months later, on a warm September morning, with wildflowers blooming in Anna's meadow, they were married by the justice of the peace in Timber Creek, with Morrison serving as witness and Kowalski, to everyone's surprise, insisting on taking photographs. The phone calls took 3 hours. Lieutenant Morrison commandeered Rolf's radio to contact his superiors, while Kowalski and Barnes waited outside in their truck, smoking cigarettes and trying to process how their elaborate joke had become something they couldn't understand. Inside the cabin, Ingrid and Rolf sat in tense silence, listening to Morrison's repeated explanations of the situation to increasingly higher-ranking officials. "Yes, sir. I understand the irregularity. No, sir. There's no evidence of coercion. Yes, sir. The family relationship appears legitimate. Each conversation brought new complications, more questions, additional requirements. Immigration law, prisoner of war protocols, security clearances, character references." The bureaucratic machinery ground slowly forward, while Ingrid's fate hung in the balance. Finally, as the afternoon sun began to slant through the cabin windows, Morrison ended his last call and turned to face them with an expression of weary relief. "Conditional approval," he announced. "Miss Hoffman can remain in Mr. Brenner's custody, pending final determination of her immigration status. There are conditions: weekly reports to the local authorities, restrictions on travel, regular check-ins with immigration officials when they're available. And Mr. Brenner, you're personally responsible for her compliance with all requirements. Any violations, and she goes straight to a detention facility." Ingrid felt her knees go weak with relief. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Don't thank me yet," Morrison warned. "This is just temporary. The final decision will take months, and there's no guarantee it will go in your favor. Immigration is backed up with thousands of displaced persons cases. You could still end up being depatriated." "I understand," Ingrid replied. 12. "But at least I'll have time to make my case properly." Morrison gathered his papers and prepared to leave, but Kowalski wasn't finished. The sergeant had been growing more agitated with each development, his crude joke transformed into something that made him look foolish rather than clever. "Number 4. This don't make no sense," he burst out as Morrison headed for the door. "We brought her here to teach the hermit a lesson, maybe have some fun with the Nazi nurse. Now you're telling me we accidentally reunited family members? That ain't what happened here." "What do you think happened here, Sergeant?" Rolf asked quietly. I think you two cooked up this story to keep her from going back where she belongs. Family connection, my foot. You probably didn't know her from Adam when we dropped her off. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a poorly tended fire. Morrison paused in his departure, clearly reluctant to reopen. Complications he'd just managed to resolve. The family relationship is documented, Rolf said calmly. I have Anna's birth certificate, immigration records showing her parents' arrival from Germany, photographs of family gatherings that include Heinrich Hoffmann. Would you like to see them? Kowalski's face reddened. Documents can be forged. Not by me, Rolf interrupted. I'm a woodworker and a former soldier, not a master forger. Besides, why would I risk federal charges to help a stranger? Maybe because she's a pretty woman and you've been alone too long on this mountain. Maybe because you gone soft in the head since your wife died. The words struck like physical blows. Ingrid saw Rolf's jaw tighten, saw his hands clench at his sides, and stepped forward before he could respond. Sergeant Kowalski, she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed in medical crisis. You brought me here expecting to find me broken or dead by spring. Instead, you find me healthy, well cared for, and claiming family rights that will keep me from being shuttled between detention camps like cargo. Perhaps your disappointment comes from the fact that your cruel joke has resulted in something good instead of the suffering you intended. Kowalski's mouth worked soundlessly for a moment. Behind him, Barnes shifted uncomfortably, finally understanding the true nature of what they had done. Furthermore, Ingrid continued, Mr. Brenner has shown me nothing but honor and respect. He has fed me, sheltered me, treated my injuries, and protected me from exactly the kind of degradation you hope to see. If that troubles you, I suggest you examine your own character rather than questioning his. Morrison cleared his throat. I think we're done here. Sergeant, get your men ready to move out. Miss Hoffman, remember weekly reports to Sheriff Peterson in Timber Creek. No travel beyond a 20-mile radius without permission, and full cooperation with all immigration officials. Mr. Brenner, you're responsible for ensuring compliance. As the soldiers prepared to leave, Ingrid felt the weight of what she had just committed to settling on her shoulders. She had chosen to stay, to fight for a life with Rolf, despite the complicated circumstances of their meeting. But she had also committed him to a responsibility he hadn't chosen, made him accountable for her actions to authorities, who would be watching for any excuse to separate them. After the trucks disappeared down the mountain road, Rolf and Ingrid stood alone in the sudden quiet of their cabin, both aware that everything had changed. They were no longer prisoner and captor, no longer strangers thrown together by circumstance. They were family in the eyes of the law, partners in a delicate negotiation with bureaucracy that could end in marriage or deportation. Are you certain about this? Rolf asked quietly. There's still time to change your mind. To take that train ticket to California. Ingrid moved to the mantelpiece where Anna's photograph smiled down at them both. I'm certain, she said. The question is whether you're ready to have family again. Rolf joined her before the photograph, and for the first time since her arrival, he spoke directly to Anna's image in Ingrid's presence. What do you think, Liebchen? Ready to share your mountain with another Hoffmann woman? The photograph offered no answer, but the late afternoon light streaming through the windows seemed to glow with approval, blessing the choice they had made to build something new from the ashes of war and loss. The photograph sat on the same windowsill where Anna's wedding ring had once caught the morning light, but now it captured something entirely different. 4 generations of faces smiling back at the camera, their eyes bright with the kind of joy that comes from stories well told and love well shared. Ingrid Brenner, now 78, and silver-haired but still carrying herself with the dignity that had sustained her through war and displacement, studied the image with satisfaction. In the front row sat her granddaughter Sarah, 22 and eager-eyed, visiting the mountain cabin for the first time since childhood. Behind them stood her daughter Catherine and son-in-law Michael, their own children clustered around them like flowers in Anna's old garden. "Tell me again about the soldiers," Sarah asked, settling into the chair by the fireplace where so many crucial conversations had taken place over the decades. "The ones who brought you here thinking it was a joke." Ingrid smiled, recognizing her own curiosity in the young woman's questions. Sarah was studying history at the university, writing her senior thesis on displaced persons after World War II. She had come to the cabin not just for a family visit, but to record the stories that had shaped their lineage. Sergeant Kowalski thought he was being terribly clever, Ingrid said, her accent still faintly coloring her words after 50 years in America. He wanted to see what would happen when a rough mountain man was saddled with a German prisoner for the winter. He expected cruelty, or at least indifference. "But grandfather already knew who you were. He knew my surname. He knew Anna's family history. What he didn't know was whether I would be someone worthy of the promise he'd made to his dying wife." Ingrid's eyes grew distant. "I think we surprised each other, your grandfather and I. We were both more broken than we admitted, both more capable of healing than we believed." The cabin hadn't changed much in the decades since that first winter together. The same stone fireplace dominated the main room. The same shelves held books in German and English. The same windows framed views of peaks that seemed eternal and unchanging. But the space felt fuller now, enriched by the accumulation of years lived together, children's laughter, echoing from bedrooms that had been added when the family grew, Christmas mornings around a tree cut from their own land, quiet evenings when Rolf would read aloud while Ingrid mended clothes or planned her community medical clinic. "He saved your life," Sarah observed, not for the first time. "And I saved his," Ingrid replied. "Not just during the blizzard, though that was dramatic enough for your grandfather to tell that story every year on our anniversary. I saved him from the slow death of isolation, from talking only to photographs and memories. He saved me from despair, from believing that the war had destroyed everything good in the world." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. 3 generations of women connected by love that had transcended borders, languages, and the terrible divisions of war. Through the window, they could see the small cemetery where Rolf rested beneath a simple stone marker, his grave marked with both American and German wildflowers that Ingrid planted fresh each spring. "Do you miss him terribly?" Sarah asked gently. "Every day," Ingrid admitted. "But I don't grieve anymore, not the way I did those first years after he died." When you've been blessed with 50 years of choosing each other daily, grief transforms into gratitude. I had a love that many people never find even once, and I found it twice, first with Klaus in the war, then with your grandfather in peace. Mother says you still talk to his photograph. Ingrid laughed, the sound rich with decades of accumulated joy. Your mother inherited her father's practical nature. She thinks sentiment is inefficient. But yes, I still talk to him, especially when I'm making decisions about the clinic or the scholarship fund we established. His voice is still the clearest one in my head when I need wisdom. The medical clinic had been Ingrid's greatest achievement beyond her family, a small facility in Timber Creek that served mountain communities, often hours away from the nearest hospital. What had started as her treating neighbors' injuries and illnesses had grown into a proper clinic with 2 doctors and 3 nurses. Funded by the foundation she and Rolf had established, using the modest wealth accumulated from careful living and smart investments. "The scholarship recipients want to name the new wing after you," Catherine said from the kitchen where she was preparing dinner. "Dr. Ingrid Brenner Memorial Wing has a nice ring to it." "I'm not dead yet," Ingrid protested with mock indignation. "And when I am, they should name it after your father. He's the one who insisted we use our savings to help other people get medical training instead of leaving it all to you children. He said you'd argue about that," Catherine laughed. "He told me once that you never could accept credit for the good you did, always wanted to share it with someone else." As evening approached, and the family prepared for their traditional dinner around the old wooden table, Ingrid found herself thinking about the continuity of love, how it passed from generation to generation, like a flame carried carefully through darkness. Anna's love had prompted the promise that brought Ingrid to this mountain. That love had grown into something new between her and Rolf, which had created Catherine and her brother Robert, which had produced grandchildren who would carry their own capacity for love into an uncertain future. "Grandmother," Sarah said as they gathered around the table, "when you look back at everything, the war, losing Klaus, being captured, coming here, do you think it was all supposed to happen the way it did?" Ingrid considered the question seriously, as she considered all questions from the young people who would inherit the world she was leaving behind. "I think," she said finally, "that love finds a way to flow like water, following whatever channels are available to it. The war carved terrible channels in all our lives, but love still found its way through. Your grandfather and I were both carved by loss, but that made us able to hold each other's love when it came." She looked around the table at faces that carried echoes of both Rolf and herself, at children who would never know the particular sorrows of their generation, but who would face their own challenges with the strength that came from being raised in love. "The details matter less than the love," she concluded, "and we have been very rich in love." Outside, snow began to fall, as it had that first night 50 years ago, but now it fell on a story complete, on a love that had transformed a cruel joke into a lasting legacy, on a family that proved the most beautiful things often grow from the darkest soil.